Disneyland Paris, From Sketch to Reality. Originally published in 2002, we're looking at the 2013 Standard English Updated Edition. Towards the end, I'll go into the publication history and different editions, but for now, let's just talk about what this book is. It is a primarily visual, design-focused Imagineering tour of Disneyland Paris circa the park's first decade. As we've so often seen in other books, trying to have just a general focus on even a single park is too vast to cover with any real depth or meaning for a single book. Even one like this, with its promising an impressive length of 320 pages, there's so much not covered. However, that this book is just on Paris still counts as a pretty worthy concept. Even though there are quite a few other books on Disneyland Paris, the vast, overwhelming majority of the available literature is focused on the US parks, so it's always a bit more exciting to see a book on one of the others. So each of the 5 lands in the park gets an average of a 50-page chapter dedicated to it, as well as a final chapter on the hotels, which I think is a really great inclusion, by the way, because the hotels may not be as interesting or magical as the park itself, but are still highly and fancifully designed by the Imagineers, so I really appreciated that they weren't overlooked, and particularly loved the inclusion of a spread that shows models for 5 hotels that were proposed but not built. Very cool. And so then within each land's chapter, it's broken down further into focuses on individual areas, attractions, stores, restaurants, etc. Some get 1 page, others, like Pirates of the Caribbean, get 20 pages, and they're all accompanied by a little bit of text specific to the attraction or whatever. Now, the text is a little troublesome in the sense that on the one hand, what is here overall is pretty great, but on the other hand, I was really shocked and disappointed by how little text there is given the rich, largely untapped subject matter, and especially given the size and page count of the book. So don't let that fool you into thinking it contains a proportional amount of information. It probably averages out to like a few sentences per page. So the content of the text is more like short Disneyland Paris trivia, behind-the-scenes facts, Easter eggs, pointing out details, maybe giving the story or explanation behind them. Now, in calling it trivia, I don't necessarily mean to imply it's trivial. Some is, when it's more just describing the attractions, or you're often presented with a piece of information and feel like there's a lot more around that should have been said to explain more and be more meaningful rather than just a frivolous comment or insubstantial fact. Or like, say for Pirates of the Caribbean, even though it's the attraction that gets the most pages/content dedicated to it, it's also one of the weakest examples of the text. Like the rest of the book, there's hardly any, of course, but mostly it's just describing the ride with maybe 3 or 4 single-sentence facts across the whole 20 pages. However, even though the text can be a little hit and miss, which is precarious with such a limited word count where you need everyone to count, but overall, this limited word count is well used with more hits than misses. So as far as such a meager offering goes, there is absolutely an enjoyable amount of very cool, insightful, interesting, well-chosen information on a lot of stuff. Being short and isolated to any one page, there's no depth to anything, but that's fine as long as that's what you're expecting and will be happy with, in which case it is enjoyable. But based on the size of the book, its blurb and subtitle, From Sketch to Reality, I guess I was expecting a more robust behind-the-scenes making of the park, but there's essentially no larger history, creation, development of the park, except for about 2 pages of that stuff at the start where the last paragraph is, they began excavation on the site, and then the next sentence is, and then the park opened. That's it, and that's not an exaggeration. That's literally how the history of the park's creation is told in this book. There's some construction stuff later on in the pages on the castle, and because the main focus of the book's content is on design, there is information to do with the creation and such here, but only as it's found in the isolated few sentence facts that pertain to whatever attraction you're reading about on that page. So it's really important to understand that in no way is this book the story of the making of this park. It's perhaps mostly random sort of trivia, although very much specific to whatever attraction you're looking at on the page. One thing the text does provide is a more focused through line to help define the book and prevent it from just feeling like a book of random unrelated trivia, is there's a wonderful emphasis on specific inspirations and ideas behind things, and the fictional backstory behind each attraction that the Imagineers create to guide and facilitate the design and storytelling. The book also makes good use of quotes from Imagineers recounting an anecdote about some specific part of the attraction's creation, and they were very well chosen, being both charming and insightful. The last video I did was on Walt Disney Imagineering, and I deliberately reviewed these books back to back to illustrate a point about good versus bad text. Because both books are similar enough in their approach, what they're trying to do, and the word count they have, that comparing them is very fair and interesting in assessing how, all else equal, what makes successful versus unsuccessful text. In the Walt Disney Imagineering book, it tried to cover Imagineering across every park and was just so generalized and theoretical and bogged down in descriptions and PR speak that even though there was relatively little text, it was still a complete boring waste of space with very few genuinely interesting facts that you have to cherry pick your way through. Whereas in this book, even though, like I said, it's not 100% amazing optimized text, but enough that it provides clear evidence in contrast to the other book as to how a much better author handles text where, even when there's still far too little of it, making sure that what is there is still worth taking up the space and providing genuinely good information. And the way this book does that in contrast to the other is that it predominantly focuses on presenting a specific information about a specific attraction. Because even though there's so much not covered in this book, he seems to have a much better understanding that saying one interesting thing about something specific is better than trying to encapsulate everything in such a general, vague, or obvious way that you end up saying nothing at all, and making sure that you give more space to the former and less to the latter. So for the most part in this book, he'll set up a general or overall idea in a concise sentence or two, and then have more of the word count focus on a specific example to illustrate it, as opposed to the other book, which was the complete opposite. Likewise, I appreciate how light this book is on the Imagineering 101 concepts that every other park-related book feels it's necessary to subject its readers to, the only exception being the pages on audio animatronics. However, as nice as the text mostly is, there's still far too little of it to be worth picking up for its own sake, but that's fine because it's not the main event. I also talked about this in the review for the Walt Disney Imagineering book. The text is here to support the main event, which is the images, and they are magnificent. Though that's not at all unusual for a visual book on the parks, but it's the choice of images combined with the quantity of images that gives this book essentially its entire value and joy. Most of the images are photos of the attractions, both wide shots and detail photography. There's some stunning aerial photography and a few behind the scenes pictures of models and Imagineers working on stuff, but the best images are of course the artworks and concept art. I read that the book contains around 250 artworks, which sounds about right, so that's a third of the images, and this abundance of art is the real draw of this book, because photos of the park are awesome, but they're so common and easily attainable that you can kind of see those anywhere, or even go take your own, but art from the WDI archives is much rarer, more interesting, and as far as I'm concerned, more fun to look at. So I really appreciate the book put a lot of emphasis on presenting a good amount of that. Also, as with every Disney park book, it's worth keeping in mind the era the photos are from. In this case, it's almost exclusively the 90s, so that has a notable impact on what you will and won't see in the book. One good thing about the never-ending stream of Disney park books is because the parks change so much over time, the books from different eras provide a visual record of extinct attractions, of which this book is now old enough to feature a couple. Almost every image is captioned, which is super helpful, and they sometimes contain interesting info themselves. A frequent problem with the captions, though, is, I don't know what the technical publishing term is, but you know the directional cues captions give to tell you which image they refer to, like bottom left, above right, that sort of thing? They are used pretty poorly, frequently being confusing, inconsistent, and unintuitive, and in some cases just completely wrong. So as I mentioned, the quantity of images is really what gives this book value and makes it a substantial enough experience despite the overly large subject matter it tries to cover. There are over 750 images, and that is made possible through the large page count and, more importantly, the modest sizing of the images. In this case, many are definitely too small, we'll get into that in a minute, but overall I far prefer this approach compared to the opposite problem we see with most books, which is images that are unnecessarily large, which result in an overall lack of content. For example, compare this book to the Tauschen book Walt Disney's Disneyland, a visual book of almost identical size and page count, also with fantastic images, but they're so huge, with mostly only one or two per page and large blank spaces, that as far as I'm concerned is not worth picking up, not worth the price, space, and most importantly, not a substantial enough experience. So I'm very glad this book took the opposite approach, because without that, it would have been pretty terrible. And this is where we get into the very, very bad aspects of this book. The first you've almost certainly noticed already, and that is, despite what I just said about this book not having the worst layout in terms of prioritizing more images over unnecessarily large images, it is still atrocious nonsense and uncontestedly the ugliest layout for a book I've ever shown on this channel. And this isn't like me nitpicking, making a big deal out of 10% of the images not having perfect layout. No, this is 90% of the pages in this book objectively having a dumpster fire layout. The amount of white space in here is preposterous. Look at how many huge blank spaces there are throughout. Look at how every image is surrounded by humongous white borders. So many of the amazing images, and particularly the artworks, are somewhat spoiled due to being far too small, yet are surrounded by empty space they could have been expanded to fill in and be more enjoyable to look at. Likewise, it's very frustrating to be reading a book that is so skimpy on text when there's all this space that could have been used for more. This is ridiculous beyond reason. Not only is the layout utterly inefficient, it has the added insult of being ugly as hell. There's no balance, symmetry, or any sort of visual page appeal with the sizing and layout of the images. I can't even call this book design amateurish, because even an amateur would possess the modicum of common sense to realize this is garbage presentation. It looks like, you know when you drag and drop images into Microsoft Word and it just sort of automatically and seemingly randomly sizes and lays out the images? That's how it looks like this book's been done. Such amazing images and otherwise great text being sabotaged by inept idiocy that defies comprehension. I praised some of the writer's abilities and decisions earlier, but when you consider he was given access to interview 70 Imagineers and has this huge canvas to present the text on, that it is so meager yet surrounded by white space that could have been used, given these conditions, he suddenly becomes a lot less impressive and, in fact, an embarrassingly slack and negligent author. And of course it's fine to do a book that is mostly just visual and only have a little bit of text to support the images, but if you're gonna do that, that means you have to nail the presentation of the images. The Walt Disney Imagineering book had far worse writing, weaker appeal and execution of its concept, and fewer images. Even the design and layout weren't 100% perfect and a little wasteful at times, but it had no white space, and overall used every inch to pack in as much content as possible, while also displaying it appropriately, and so had a discernible intelligence and skill behind it. Whereas with this book, it's so hard to reconcile the idea that the design is dismal, brain-dead trash, while still managing to be ultimately successful through doing right by those things that are most important. Because like I said, it could have been far worse and even disastrous for the book were it not for the emphasis on presenting a greater number of images, so I can't understate how important that is in essentially saving this book. But given everything else that's going on in the mindless layout, I'm not convinced that this was an intelligent, calculated decision, but rather some sort of happy accident. In the acknowledgements, the author mentions it took them 5 years to bring this book to life. I imagine most of that was waiting on Disney and gathering all the pieces, because it certainly wasn't spent on design and writing. The word count's so small that even if you wrote just one word per day, it wouldn't take 5 years. That's hyperbole, but not by much. So it feels like they spent 5 years getting all the pieces together, but when it came to actually making the book, the writer spent about 5 hours and the designer spent about 5 minutes. Thankfully, the book's concept, page count, image content, and quantity are enough to outweigh that crap and still makes it very enjoyable despite inexcusable lazy negligence in those two areas trying to drag it down and prevent it from being the best it could be, as is so often the case with books, unfortunately. But if nothing else, it at least still manages to brute force its way into being successful enough by delivering on the areas most important to its appeal, value, and enjoyment. Unless, of course, you are more interested in a deeper, substantial history and behind-the-scenes information, in which case you'll still be disappointed. So as I said at the start, this book was originally published in 2002 in French and English. The English translation was done by someone other than the author, and it's perfect as far as I can tell. Had I not known beforehand, I wouldn't have even suspected it was translated. Also, I really appreciate that they did separate editions for each language, as a lot of other Disneyland Paris books just do one bilingual edition, which is stupid because then all that space is taken up by repeating the same text in 2 languages, so not subjecting us to that is another point in their favor, though perhaps that's not as impressive since there's definitely enough wasted blank space in here that they could have printed both languages anyway, but at least in terms of the principle, it's highly approved of. There were also collector's editions produced. They have exactly the same interior content, they just came with some lithographs and some other unnecessary fancy production gilding and a glossier paper. The regular edition that we've been looking at here has perhaps more of a silky matte quality paper, but it's perfect as is, so I don't see the glossy paper as being any sort of draw. Then there was a second print reprinting of the collector's edition in 2012 and the regular edition in 2013, which again is what we're looking at here. This edition was also updated. I don't know all the updates exactly, but most important is knowing that it does include new pages and content. As far as I can tell, the only way to know the difference between the 2002 and 2013 editions just based on the cover is on the bottom of the 2002 edition. It says Nouveau Millénaire editions, while the 2013 version says Neverland editions. So keep that in mind if you go looking for a second-hand copy so you know exactly what edition you're getting. Also, take all my publication history and edition information with a grain of salt, as I could be mistaken about particulars since I found a lot of conflicting and confused information while researching that. They've also since released an even more updated so-called special edition ebook if you're into that sort of thing. Also, that they did an updated edition of this book but didn't fix any of the foolish layout is insane. I loathe updated editions of books in general, but at least if they'd have used it to acknowledge and fix the layout, that would have been a worthy update, and seen as an admirable display of pride in your creation and commitment to making it the best it can be. But that they didn't use that opportunity to do that and just doubled down on being incompetent slackers makes me feel so resentful paying for rewarding someone for continued unrepentant shoddy work. I mean, they didn't even bother to fix the captioning errors. Though I also blame the readership for this too. Every single review I read for this book raves about it, frequently to the point of blatantly lying about what it offers, and I know that comes from a good place, but they're expressing feeling more than thinking. Of course, subjective feeling is valid, and honestly the only thing that actually matters in terms of your personal experience, opinion, and enjoyment, but it's not always helpful in certain cases if it's dominating objective thinking. It's okay to like something, express the joy it brings, celebrate the things that make it great, and acknowledge its weaknesses, but except for two tiny grumbles about how text-light the book is, I otherwise didn't see a single sentence approaching even the gentlest constructive suggestion or assessment of this book's limitations. Just Disney zealots unwilling to see past their personal adoration for the subject the book is on and laud it as the greatest book ever made. And it's because of people like that we're subject to so many unimpressive books that don't live up to their potential because there's no demand for true excellence. Such an obviously stupid and mishandled thing that should never have even been an issue is not only permissible, but given untempered praise and reward without any reproach, and it sets the bar so low for future books as to what's considered acceptable and successful, so how can we ever expect to see better books? So like in this case, there was no incentive for them to fix the book for the reprint. In fact, maybe they weren't even aware of the issues, though I find that hard to believe, but it's possible when they're being so overwhelmingly acclaimed without any constructive feedback, there's no need to assess room for improvement. Mindless consumers allow for mindless creators. It's been sort of hard for me to refer to this book's authors as lazy or careless when they are clearly passionate fans who instigated this project themselves and went to an enormous amount of hard work to make it happen. For a lot of books, companies, publishers, and authors just approach them as a low-effort cash grab promo, but I don't get the impression at all that that was a factor here. So then it's like, well, if they're not lazy or apathetic, then what's the reason for the book's obvious deficiencies? Is it that they are just simply too stupid and inept to do it the right way? Well, even that I find hard to rationalize given how this isn't something that requires great intelligence or skill, just basic common sense. Everyone has the capacity to do this. So I just can't understand how it's possible for the author-designer to be so clueless that they could do such an obviously and objectively heinous job without realizing it. It's all particularly unimpressive when you also consider how expensive the book was even on release. If you're trying to charge people an above-average price tag, you'd better be offering an above-average level of care and skill to create a masterfully handled and polished product that reflects that. It's so frustrating that 90% of my discontent for this book stems from such a simple issue with such an easy fix, and that is, all they had to do was lay the images out a little better and use that space for more text ideally, but even if that wasn't possible for whatever reason, just scaling the images up a little bit to fill in most of that white space and all of the ranting and insulting I've done would have been replaced with significantly more praise and positivity. It's such a simple thing that shouldn't have even been an issue to begin with, yet it's causing big core problems, spoiling this book from being the best it could be. It's interesting, I'm not actually sure if this is considered an official Disney product. It is authorized and was even sold in the park, but it was still a self-published affair, so I'm surprised and impressed that Disney allowed the authors to self-publish a book like this, but also curious why they didn't force them to do it under a bigger publisher or otherwise support a larger print run, etc. Because despite all the condemnation I just gave this book, it's still better than plenty of the official park books, all those from bigger publishers, though that's really not saying much. But speaking of other books, for Disneyland Paris specifically, I haven't read any, so I can't comment on how they compare to this book, which is potentially very important, particularly with regards to my praise for the information contained in the text. How much of that comes from other sources or has been repeated elsewhere, I can't say unfortunately, but for the sake of pointing you in the direction for further exploration. The blurb on the dust jacket appears to claim that this is the first book to give a behind-the-scenes look at Disney Paris, but that's just simply not true. The first was the souvenir book for the park's opening in 1992 called Euro Disney, and it's in English. There are also a couple of other little 64-page behind-the-scenes guidebook type things from around that time. Also at the opening there was Euro Disney Connaissance des Arts, and there was an English edition of that as well. And then there are two anniversary books, Disneyland Paris 20 Years of Dreams and Disneyland Paris 25 A to Z. They both look pretty cool, but I'm worried it might end up being a little too cheesy and promo-y as many official park books are wont to do. Also, even though they're much longer than the other souvenir guides, that might not be as impressive as it seems considering these two are bilingual French and English in one edition. There's an unofficial book called The Story of Disneyland Paris, which is a non-visual text history, so if it's well written it could work as a really nice complement to the visual heavy text light nature From Sketch to Reality. There are also individual books for Pirates of the Caribbean, The Phantom Manor and Space Mountain that specifically focus on the Parisian version of each of those rides. Conceptually I love that and they look very fetching, but sadly seem rather light on the content side, doubly so because they're also bilingual. And saving the most exciting for last is The Art of Disneyland Paris, which just came out at the start of this month, and I definitely hope to do a review of that, scalpers and shipping prices willing. Based on what art and how much is contained in that book, it'll be interesting to see if it significantly undermines From Sketch to Reality's value, since the concept art is the biggest thing it has going for it. Though I will say a final word in favor of From Sketch to Reality, and that is it has significantly more pages than any of the other books, and that counts for a lot. Though again, don't let that fool you, because it doesn't count for as much as it should, given that, you know, just because something's spaced out over 300 pages, it doesn't mean it has 300 pages worth of content. Collectively, the ludicrous amount of white space probably equals 80 blank pages, but even so, as it stands, if you only want to get one book on Disneyland Paris but want to make sure you're getting the most out of it, then this is still the one to beat. Though it does feel like it's just keeping that throne warm until something better comes along. I wanted to highlight some specific examples to rake over the coals, but it's basically the whole book. We'd be here all day. And I mean, I'm sure you can see what I'm talking about anyway, but I have to vent my contempt on something, so I'll just pick an example that might not be as apparent when just flipping through. They apparently have zero concern with how best to show and prioritize images, like there's this. In a book where most of the images are far too small to fully appreciate, very wise of them to give 2 whole pages to this really deserving, amazing photo. And I mean, look at this page. In the bottom right, we have a piece of art that is not only gorgeous, but it's also an early exploratory concept for something that doesn't exist, so a very important and interesting piece, yet it's been shrunk down to take up only 1/10 of the page, when not only is there an abundance of white space on the page, but look at the top image and how big it is. Specifically, look at the top left of the image. It's just boring black space, yet equal in size to the entire artwork below. You don't think it might have been a good idea to crop the nothingness out of that photo, shrink it down, and instead give that space and priority to what is obviously the more worthy image? This is what I'm talking about when I say this isn't something that requires great intelligence or skill. Just common sense. Everyone has the ability to do this. I just don't understand how it's possible for someone who presumably cares about their work to be this mindless and incompetent.